So the next two lectures are going to be on sex and sexual selection. So this might be of interest, okay? So and we're going to talk about it the first part we're going to talk about is what I'm going to contrast is the evolution of sexual versus asexual reproduction. And I think this is actually, well, it used to be my research area, and it's something I studied a freshwater snail that is capable of both cloning itself and reproducing sexually. So one of the things I'm interested in is, what's most common in most organisms, at least vertebrates and most invertebrates? Sexual reproduction, right? And most of them aren't capable of cloning themselves, okay? And so there's a preponderance of sexual reproduction in most eukaryotes. And so we might want to understand why is that. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. The first thing is, when is sexual reproduction favored and when might asexual reproduction be favored? So what we're first going to do is, what are asexual and sexual reproduction? And what can we infer about sexual and asexual reproduction by looking at the phylogenetic distribution of these two modes of reproduction on phylogenetic trees? And it's pretty simple. And then the last thing, which is a little more complicated, but hopefully I can summarize, is so whenever and we're going to spend a lot of time now moving into looking at costs and benefits of traits. And we're going to do this in terms of sexual reproduction. We're going to look at it in terms of exaggerated traits that males often have that are involved in sexual selection. And what we're going to really look at, we're going to spend a lot of time on costs and benefits of particular kinds of traits. And the relative costs and benefits of traits influence whether they are maintained, lost, or those sorts of things. So we're going to look at the costs and benefits of sexual and asexual reproduction in the context of parasites, that is host-parasite interactions, what we call beneficial mutations, deleterious mutations, and environmental predictability. And we're going to talk about specific examples of how we use this. So all of these organisms right here reproduce asexually. So this is a marine clam. Here's a little guppy, a spicillid guppy, that actually is capable of asexual reproduction. Here's one of the, these are New Zealand snails. They're going to be the focus of most of what we talk about. And here they have individuals that can clone themselves and reproduce sexually. These are some of the most classic examples of asexual reproduction. These are the Deloid rotifers. And it turns out this is a class of organisms that has been asexual and clonally reproducing for 30 million years. So they've somehow escaped the problems of asexual reproduction, and it turns out it's kind of interesting. Here are dandelions, right? They actually can clone themselves, and the seeds that they produce are often from cloning. Here's a beetle that does it. This is probably a Mojave Desert beetle, and there are a bunch of them. And then I think I'm not sure if this is a walking stick, and there's also walking sticks in the Mojave Desert. There are about 13 species. Some of them are sexual and asexual. So, but all these things do it. So these we're going to show you are kind of the exceptions. But first we need to ask, what is asexual reproduction? So what do you guys think it is? You basically don't need a partner. And it's usually all female reproduction. So males aren't necessary, okay? There are various ways to do this, though. Well, let's just talk about what sexual reproduction is. What we call, and I'm not going to ask, amphimixis or sexual reproduction has these typical things. Again, I'm not asking you to do all this, right? But basically, you have individuals 1 and 2, right, that basically go through meiosis to produce haploid gametes, right, egg and sperm. So you go, each parent, individual 1 and 2, goes through a diploidy to haploidy cycle. Gametes fuse, right? So each parent's going through meiosis 1, meiosis 2, and a haploid reduction, and the fusion of those gametes, eggs and sperm. And gametes fuse and recombination occurs during meiosis, and we'll come back to this. This tends to generate a lot of variability. And in general, we're going to assume most males and females usually are unrelated, okay? So one of the key thing here is you need two individuals. Gametes are produced through haploid reduction and then this fusion phase. So gametes fuse and diploidy is restored in the zygote, okay? So there's a lot of potential in here for recombination. When homologous chromosomes cross over, you can produce a lot of variability. And you also have the variability among individuals, okay? Asexual reproduction, often called parthenogenesis. And this is the production of offspring from unfertilized gametes, and it usually means female-only reproduction. So all of those, not all those things I showed previously are basically, when you go into those populations, they're all female. Okay? There are no males there. There's one, we're just going to focus, I'm not going to go through all these details. Apomixis, this is what the snails that I study, the one in the New Zealand snail, most of the other things we look at, Bdelloid rotifers, have actually a kind of weird amphimixis. But there are different ways to do it. One is apomixis and one is amphimixis. We'll just focus on apomixis. It's kind of the easiest to understand. The basic idea here is what females do is they produce diploid gametes. They never undergo meiosis at all. And these unfertilized diploid gametes kind of undergoes a mitosis-like cell division that produces two daughter cells. So basically, the female produces eggs. They're not haploid. They're diploid. Okay? And there's actually no recombination, there's no meiosis going on at all. They basically do this mitotic-like cell division that produce two daughter cells, and there's no recombination. Amphimixis kind of does some weird things where you produce haploid gametes, but diploidy is restored when these two things fuse. So offspring are formed by replication. So the key thing is they only require a female to reproduce. In most cases in apomixis, you have no other individuals that you're mating with, right? And you have no meiosis, so there's no recombination going on. Okay. So, and you can do this in any sort of phylogenetic tree in most eukaryotes, and you get this pattern. What you find is what's represented in blue are branches that lead to the tips, and these would be asexually reproducing species or asexually reproducing populations within a species. The orange represents sexual reproduction. So what we've done, we've taken a phylogenetic tree and we've mapped the kind of reproduction onto it. So what does this suggest? And here's the ancestor, and this is not true for Bdelloid rotifers. They're all asexual, so they're the weird exception. So this suggests that how many populations or species of asexually reproducing groups are there? 3. Is there much of a history of asexual reproduction deep in the tree? No. So basically what it's saying is these 3 asexual populations or species have arisen independently, and they're relatively rare. And why do we say they're short-lived? Yeah. So if you saw that, in fact, this whole clade, right, the sister taxa here, if they were all blue, that would suggest they kind of persisted for a long period of evolutionary time. But what it suggests here is they kind of arise in this common ancestor, and they don't persist for very long. So this is extremely common. Bdelloid rotifers are the only ones that don't show this pattern. In most asexual eukaryotes, this is the pattern you see. So what does this suggest? What's the better thing to do? What's more advantageous? Sexual reproduction, right? And so it suggests there's selection is, they arise, but asexual populations or asexual organisms don't persist for very long. So there must be something that's precluding them from persisting. Well, this is kind of surprising. And this is what's called the paradox of sexual reproduction. What this suggests is that, in fact, asexual reproduction should be a lot more common than it is because there's a huge advantage to being asexual. And what it's saying here, and we'll kind of go through this example, what I just showed you is asexual reproduction doesn't seem to be very common, but this suggests, well, it should be pretty common because it has a huge advantage each generation. So it turns out there's another kind of cost, but it turns out there seems to be a twofold cost to sexual reproduction each generation. So how can it be so common? So let me just try to run you through this. Here are the sexually reproducing females, and here are the asexually reproducing females. Okay? So here's the female, sexual female. Who's she got to be with? A male. Okay? Here's an asexual female. Does she need a partner to produce offspring? Nope. Okay? Haploid effusion of gametes. How many offspring are risen to by a sexually reproducing female? 4. Okay? How many are male and how many are female? So we're just saying, we're assuming kind of equal sex ratios, and so on average she produces both 2 female daughters and 2 male sons. Okay? How about this asexual female? She produces 4 females. Keep doing that. Look what happens. Actually, it turns out there's a twofold cost every generation to sexual reproduction because you have to produce males. Do males produce their own offspring? Can I give rise directly to an offspring? No. I have to do it through mating and fusion of gametes, right? Asexual females don't. So it turns out, if you keep doing this, what eventually happens? Basically, the asexual reproducers basically outcompete the sexual individuals. And the reason is, the terminology is that in general, when you look at they have a asexuals have a twofold reproductive advantage each generation because they're not producing any males. They're producing all offspring that can give rise directly to 4 offspring that are capable of reproducing. So you can run these simulations. It doesn't take very long for an asexual female to eliminate a sexual female, often within 8 to 10 generations. So this suggests, shouldn't they be more common? Okay. So basically what this is boiled down to, John Maynard Smith, a British evolutionary biologist, basically said that in general males are worthless. Okay? That was his way to put it. And some people get, upset at that phrasing. But anyway, in this context, well, all he's saying was that males don't give rise directly to offspring, right? Females do, and these asexual females have this huge, huge fitness advantage, presumably each generation. So this is called the twofold cost of sex each generation. So how does that jive with what we just showed? What do you think? Is there something else going on? Okay. Let me just show you a quick experiment that demonstrated that very fact. And this was done in a New Zealand snail. And they set up this real simple lab experiment where they put both the initial frequency of asexual individuals in these are 14 different replicates. The initial frequency of asexual individuals, think of these as 14, and they did this in Petri dishes, or to-go cups, beer to-go cups, right? You can raise these things and put some algae in there and they do fine. So they put about 35% of the individuals were asexual individuals and about 65% were sexual individuals. And they did this in 14 cups. And then they ran this for a year. And this is the initial frequency of asexual individuals, and this is the percentage of asexuals after the end of the experiment in 1 year. What happened? What increased? Yep. Turns out the asexuals went from about 35% to around 60% of the individuals in each of these 14 populations, basically saying these asexual females had a huge advantage and we're going to eventually replace those sexual females. Okay. All this demonstrates is this cost of sex. That, in fact, asexual reproduction is much more efficient and should eliminate sexual individuals. So that beer cup was, I'm just putting this in there, it's kind of a simple, non-variable environment. I'm just going to introduce this, and then I'm going to stop, and I'm going to talk about the exams and turn it back. But this is going to be, we're then going to kind of go through each one of these hypotheses to try to explain why sexual reproduction is so common. And when you think about it, what do you think? Why do you think what's good about sexual reproduction? Variability, right? You clone yourself, you're producing exact clonal replicates. There might be some cost in terms of being able to respond to environmental variation, and that environmental variation could be a lot of different things. We're also going to talk about how it affects mutation accumulation, which is believed to be one of the biggest things. Okay. So here's the idea. Here's the New Zealand snail, beautiful lakes in the South Island of New Zealand where this work's been done. So here's basically some of the ideas that we're going to talk about. We're going to look at each one, some of these hypotheses. So what we're saying here is if the environmental unpredictability is low, right? Or, you know, if you think about it, the environment's pretty predictable, what might be favored? We suggest asexual reproduction. If there's not a lot of complexity to the environment, it's real simple, there's not a lot of environmental variability, number of niches, we haven't really gotten to that, we might imagine asexual reproduction would be favored. The other idea is that if parasites aren't we'll come back, we're going to talk about an example of this, but if parasites aren't very common in an environment, we're suggesting if there's a low risk of being parasitized, asexual reproduction would be favored. We're going to I'll try to explain how that happens. At the other extreme, we might expect sexual reproduction to be favored. If the environment fluctuates a lot, there's a lot of environmental heterogeneity, things are, you know, unpredictable from season to season, year to year, a lot of environmental unpredictability, maybe sexual reproduction that produces a lot of variability might be favored. If there's a lot of environmental and niche variability, sexual reproduction will be favored. And the other idea, if there's a high risk of parasitism, the idea here, if there are lots of parasites, maybe it's advantageous to produce offspring that are different from you. Why do you think that is? Let me just ask this last question. Why do you think, what would be the advantage to reproduce sexually if you're being parasitized? Go ahead. Yeah. So one of the ideas might be that if, you know, there's a parasite out there that's well adapted to you or to the population, right, by producing genetically variable offspring, maybe they can escape that parasite. And we're going to talk about what's called the Red Queen hypothesis. And we'll show you some data that suggests this thing's kind of important. Okay. So what we'll do next time is we're kind of going to go through the data that show this, and then that's it. So if you have a chance, read some of this stuff on this New Zealand snail, and we'll be talking about lake and stream populations that kind of address those hypotheses. Okay. Let me stop this.